Now, we've all had to work with difficult people. In fact, maybe they're sitting right next to you right now. And how we get along with our colleagues and bosses at work deeply impacts our day-to-day lives. Our next speaker is someone who has done extensive research and work in this space. It is my pleasure to introduce our second speaker on the stage today, Amy Gallo. Amy is the author of the recently published book, Getting Along: How to Work with Anyone, Even Difficult People. She's also doing a book signing after this, so you can get a copy of it yourself, and is co-host of the Harvard Business Review's Women at Work podcast. Please join me in welcoming Amy Gallo to the South by Southwest stage.
Hello. Actually, I'm going to do that intro again. My daughter is a 16-year-old, and she wants to start a skipping club at high school, which is not about skipping classes. It's actually about skipping from one place to another. So I'm going to skip on stage. I think she'd be really happy about this. In heels, mind you. All right. Thank you all for being here. I'm Amy. As Katie said, I get to work on some really cool stuff. I just wrote a book called, ooh, that's not my slide. Let's try that. I just wrote a book called Getting Along. That is what I'm going to talk about most today. But I'm also a contributing editor at Harvard Business Review and the co-host of the HBR's Women at Work podcast. If anyone listens to it, wants to talk to me about it, it's one of my favorite projects. But I want to talk to you about relationships. And I have a story I want to tell you from earlier in my career that I'm not super proud of. It was my second job. I was in my mid-20s. And there was a woman I really enjoyed working with. She's actually become a friend, which is interesting given the story. But she asked me one day, after we had really good time working on this project together, she said, "Do you want to have brunch this weekend or something?" And I looked her straight in the eye, no irony, just said, "I'm not here to make friends." I know that sounds really mean, and it was, but I actually believed it. For the very first part of my career, I was like, why would I make friends at work? I have friends. I have friends from college. I have my roommates. Why do I need friends at work? Now, I have come to learn, which something that many, many people already knew, and that decades and decades of research shows, which is that the quality of our life is dependent on the quality of our relationships. If you look at the Harvard Adult Development Study, which is one of the longest longitudinal studies that's been done about happiness, it shows for sure that our relationships matter. And that's true for our friendships, that's true for our relationships in the community, with our neighbors, with our family, but that's also true of our relationships with our coworkers. It's in those relationships that we find the emotional sustenance to thrive. How many people know who Vivek Murthy is? So Vivek, not many of you. Vivek's actually spoken here. I should call him Dr. Murthy, actually. So Dr. Murthy is the Surgeon General of the US. He was the Surgeon General under Obama. He came back under Biden, which is wonderful. He's a wonderful person. He wrote a book about loneliness called Togetherness. And he really, really lays out the case for why we need connections. Now, let's be honest. Most of our relationships at work are probably good, but occasionally we have to work with some difficult people. And maybe in your head you imagine those difficult people look like some of these monsters here. It's totally understandable if you feel like you work with some monsters. In fact, a recent study showed that 80% of people said they worked with a terrible coworker. And 83%, not surprisingly, said it affected the quality of their work. Now, just show of hands, how many people would say they're working with someone who they find terrible right now? That's a lot of you. I love the cheering. Yes, I work with someone terrible. Amazing. I want you to ask yourself, so maybe you don't work with someone terrible now. Congratulations to those of you who did not raise your hands. But you've worked with someone in the past who you found terrible, I'm guessing. And I want you to ask yourself what it was like to work with that person, or what it's currently like to work with that person. What happens in your body when you have to think about them, send them a Slack message, be in a meeting with them, have to have a conversation with them? How does it feel? And if you could choose one word to describe how it feels, what would that one word be? You can just shout it out. Anxious, horrible, draining, stressful, what else? Nasty, panic. Oh my gosh, these are good words. I notice none of you are like joyous, excited, like my best self, right? Of course, that's understandable. No one wants to work with someone terrible, and the impact of that negative interaction, of working with someone who we find terrible or uncivil, who mistreats us. Maybe they demean us, maybe they undermine us. Maybe they're just a pain. Maybe they're just annoying. Has serious consequences. You know, a lot of people, I actually work at Harvard Business Review, as I mentioned, a lot of my fellow editors love things like strategy, operations, supply chain, like the real, what we call hard stuff in business. And I really like to focus on what we call the soft stuff. And I think a lot of my fellow editors think of the soft stuff as sort of the icing on the cake. Like, yeah, relationships are good. They help us do the really hard strategy. To me, that's the cake. How we interact with one another is how we get work done. You can have the smartest minds in the room. You can have the best strategy. You can have people who are just so good at operations. Whether or not they succeed will depend on the quality of their interactions. So this is not the icing. This is the cake. Now, when you're dealing with someone who you find terrible or you find difficult, you might think, well, I've been dealing with people my whole life. I know what to do. I'm just gonna follow my brain's instincts. I'm just gonna do what my body tells me to do in that moment. Now, there's two problems with that. Our brains actually don't work with us in these moments. And let me tell you a story. Again, as an editor at HBR, I get a lot of people who were interested in contributing articles. And it means I'm dealing with tons and tons of emails every day, requests from people who have really great ideas. And unfortunately, I don't have time to give every single one of them. And there was someone, let's call him Brad, who had submitted an article and wanted to follow up. And I said, Brad, I emailed him, I said, Brad, we're gonna get to you, I promise, we're gonna review your piece, I'll get back to you. He said, could we just hop on the phone? I said, I'm so sorry, I wish I had time. And to be fair, it was a particularly busy time. Sometimes I will hop on the phone, but it just was really busy. And he didn't like that answer, and he came back, he said, no, really, let's just hop on the phone, can we have a half-hour call? And I said, I just can't, I'm sorry. And he wrote this email back that said, human connection is the most important thing. I can't handle the ego. I will take my writing elsewhere. You're very quiet. Does anyone think that was like a fair email? Like, you know, yeah. I mean, and to be fair, he wanted something. I get it. He was being assertive. But I can tell you word for word what that email said because of the negativity bias. It's the same reason I can tell you a line from my performance review in 2001, which that said I didn't have business acumen, by the way, right? But I can't tell you all the positive things that were in the review. I can't tell you about the other probably 150 neutral or positive emails I got the day I got that email from Brad. And our brains are so focused on protecting ourselves, on sensing, looking for threat, that it hangs on the negative. So when you have a difficult interaction with someone, it's immediately focused on the worst case scenario. And then because of a psychological concept called premature cognitive commitment, which is basically the story you tell yourself, right? So immediately in my head, Brad is a jerk. I am just doing my job. Why is he raining on my parade? Right? And then the story starts to evolve in, what if Brad's right? Do I not care about human connection? So, and I'm slowly gathering, because of confirmation bias, evidence to prove that Brad is a jerk and I am right. Right? That is what we want. When we're in a difficult situation, we want to feel okay. Our brain senses for that threat. So because of this negativity bias and because of the stories we tell ourselves, we get really stuck. And I noticed no one actually, maybe some of you, I didn't hear all the words you were shouting about, but none of you mentioned that feeling of being stuck. Like you can't actually get out of the situation with this person. And that's really how I feel when I'm trying to deal with someone who's pushing my buttons, right? I feel really stuck. And what we need are tools and tactics and frameworks that help us get unstuck. And that's what I want to share with you today. So to get unstuck, let's first talk about what our goal is. Number one, our goal is stronger relationships. We want to be connected with our colleagues, not just because it feels good, but because it's good for the work. In fact, there is tons and tons of research about the positive benefits of having friends at work. I think back to my 25-year-old self looking my friend Gretchen in the eye and saying, I'm not here to make friends, and boy, was I wrong. And in fact, the ironic thing about that statement is that I made friends in every work context I've been in since, right? We have to have those friendships. There's a study done by a group of researchers at Rutgers that showed that people who said they had a best friend at work actually had higher performance ratings, right? So this isn't, again, about feeling good. This is about the work that we actually do. And it is better when we have friends, when we feel connected. Now, of course, your difficult colleague is not going to turn into your BFF overnight. In fact, I would posit they're probably never going to turn into your BFF. I've heard it occasionally happen. But you want to have at least a neutral relationship with them. And this is where the second goal comes in, which is you want to develop interpersonal resilience. And this is the feeling that when you are in a challenging situation, when you have that colleague who pushes your buttons, that you feel more confident interacting with them. You feel less of the stuckness, less of the anxiety, less of the frustration, and you feel like, I can handle this. And when you are deep in those interactions, you feel less stress as a result, right? That's really what you want to develop. Now, not all terrible coworkers are created equally. And one of the reasons I wrote my book, Getting Along, was that because a lot of the advice that was out there, including in my first book, which is the HBR Guide to Dealing with Conflict, is very generic. What are the tools and frameworks you need to deal with anyone who you're having conflict with or who you're disagreeing with? And that is useful. But what I knew from my work is that there were specific tactics, specific tools that you could use depending on the pattern of behavior that you're dealing with. So how you would deal with a pessimistic colleague would be very different from how you deal with a passive-aggressive colleague. Of course, there are principles that apply in all those situations, but you can also use specific tactics to try to neutralize that behavior, to try to shift the dynamic with the other person. And that's why I came up with 8 archetypes. These are the patterns of behavior that we regularly see when dealing with someone we find difficult. So just show of hands, how many people, when they saw this list, were like, oh yeah, I saw my coworker there, immediately knew that they were dealing with someone on this list? That's most of you. Okay, how many people looking at this list are thinking, oh, that's me? I only saw 2 hands, and I don't believe that. I'm gonna ask the question, how many people look at this list and think, oh, that's me? Yeah. I will tell you, when I wrote this book, the original chapters, these archetype chapters, had a section, if this is you. And the manuscript was way too long. And my editor and I were discussing, what do we cut? And he proposed cutting those what if this is you chapters, or sections. And I was really hesitant about doing it. But our discussion was like, oh, people aren't gonna have the self-awareness to think they're the pessimist, or they're passive-aggressive, or they're the insecure boss. The book came out September 13th. By 9 p.m. on September 13th, I had no less than 15 LinkedIn messages, emails, and Instagram messages telling me, I realized I am this person. And I think I hugely underestimated the self-awareness that people have, that they fall into one of these categories. And I share that. I know you came here to learn how to not deal with yourself, but deal with other people. But I share that because I think you have to have the empathy to understand good people fall into these categories. None of us is above being passive aggressive, playing the victim, playing some office politics, right? So rather than using these archetypes as labels that distance yourself from the other person, think of them as diagnostics. You have to figure out what is the behavior that you're dealing with in order to take steps to address it. What are the patterns that you see in your colleague that are problematic for you? And how do you address those? And when you do, when you notice that you're dealing with something that you think is passive-aggressive behavior, or maybe someone who's behaving in a biased way, you then have to ask yourself a very important question before you proceed, which is my perception of their behavior laden with bias? Because it is very easy to look at someone who's doing something differently than you, right? Who is pushing your buttons, who's doing something you think might be inappropriate, and quickly slap a label on them without recognizing the way that bias plays a role. And I will tell you, when Brad sent that email, I've never met Brad, I never saw a picture of Brad, I knew nothing, I had a little bio of Brad. But when he sent that email, I was like, typical white man. So arrogant, right? We have to watch for the bias. When people don't behave the same way as us, they don't think the same way as us, they don't speak the same way as us, we quickly want to label that as difficult. Our brains like to sort things into easy categories, but you have to watch out for that. The other way we need to beware of bias is that the workplace, and I'm sure this comes as no surprise to all of you, the workplace doesn't work the same way for everyone. So in terms of what's available to us, let's take passive-aggressive behavior, for example. Some people are allowed to say exactly what they think. They don't have to caveat it. They don't have to sort of hide it under sort of a series of exclamation points in an email, right? They can just say what they mean. Other people, maybe who don't have access to traditional power, who might be penalized for being assertive, they might resort to passive aggression because it's the only way to get their point across in that context. So make sure you're questioning whether bias is playing a role in your perception of their behavior and the archetype that you're landing on. Now, once you do decide, okay, I am dealing with the pessimist person, or I am dealing with the political operator or the tormentor, the thing you do not want to do is go right to that person and say, by the way, I figured it out. You're the tormentor, and here's what we're gonna do. In fact, you never utter this label to the other person. It is not helpful, right? This is meant to be a self-diagnostic, right? So you can figure out what you're dealing with, and then you ask yourself a series of questions. Because there's a lot of this behavior, right? Political operating, know-it-all, pessimistic behavior, that is annoying. That's really irritating. But it's not necessarily problematic, right? Your know-it-all colleague occasionally saying, well, in my last job, right, referring to the incredibly illustrious tech company he used to work for, right? That's annoying, but is it problematic? The know-it-all behavior, for example, becomes problematic when they interrupt, when they cut you off, when they proclaim things that just aren't true. I'm a know-it-all, by the way, so all those things I've done probably in the last week. But you have to figure out what is actually problematic about the behavior. What's the behavior you want to address? Then you want to think, what is a rational explanation for that behavior? Not because you're trying to excuse their behavior, not because you're trying to justify it, but because once you have a little bit of empathy, you have that realization, right, none of us are above these patterns of behavior, then you're going to be in a much better frame of mind to collaborate to solve it, And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. You also have to ask yourself, what role might I be playing? With a passive-aggressive colleague, have you made it clear you don't like to be disagreed with? So they're trying to find ways to show you they have a difference of opinion through their behavior, through their eye rolling, through their snarky comments, none of which is fun, but it may be that you're encouraging it. Do you have a culture of toxic positivity? So your pessimist feels like they constantly have to poke holes because people are missing huge, important risks in the work. And then you ask yourself, okay, what tactics should I try? How am I going to try to address this behavior? All right, let's see what that looks like with two of these archetypes. We'll start with the insecure boss. I'm assuming no one in here identifies as an insecure boss, so we're good, right? First question is, what behavior is problematic? It is absolutely normal to feel insecure. In fact, I would posit that everyone in this room has felt insecure today. Maybe it was about your outfit, maybe it was about what session to go to, maybe it was about, oh, did I catch up on those emails? Like, am I doing the right thing? I have the self-doubt. Those who do not experience any insecurity or any self-doubt, that we have a label for those people, and they're psychopaths. Truly. So think about that when you're dealing with their boss, and you're thinking, well, I don't like that they're not sure of themselves. I wish they were more confident. I wish they were more decisive. Just remember that we all feel insecure. And there's interesting research that actually shows the higher up in an organization a leader gets, the more insecure they feel. Because the gap between what the expectations are for them and their actual skills tends to get broader. So you might assume, why does my boss feel insecure? They have the title, they have the salary, they have the authority, right? But oftentimes bosses feel insecure. So what's the problematic behavior? Perhaps they're micromanaging. Perhaps they're hoarding information. Perhaps they're preventing you from interacting with people who you need to interact with to do your job. Those are the behaviors you want to address. Now, what might explain it? Again, we all feel insecure at times. And especially as a boss, you might be more prone to feeling that. And how might you be playing a role? Is it possible that you signal to your boss that you are a threat, that you don't trust them, that you're out for their job? Maybe you have not done that explicitly, but maybe you've done that implicitly. Then the question is, what tactics do you want to try? Now, you might think this is a strange tactic, but if you think about the fact that insecurity is often fed by threat, this is a tactic that Lindy Greer, who's a professor at University of Michigan, gave me when I interviewed her for the book. She studies a lot about conflict, what makes a great team, what makes a great leader. And I asked her, have you ever dealt with an insecure boss? And she said, oh yeah. And I said, what worked? She goes, well, I had a coach at the time, and the coach told me to imagine myself as a cute, fluffy squirrel. I was like, okay, that's a little strange. Tell me more. And she explained that her and her coach figured out that her boss was probably feeling really threatened by Lindy. Lindy's a superstar, right? And so when Lindy interacted with her boss, she never said, I'm a cute, fluffy squirrel. Please don't do that. People will be very confused. But she imagined herself as a cute, fluffy squirrel, not to undermine her authority or her superstarness, but just to soften her edges in her own mind. And she found it worked. Right? So think about, how do I make sure that my boss sees me as an ally? Right? Now, here's another piece of advice I don't love to give, but the research on this is clear, that one of the things that helps an insecure manager is some well-placed compliments. Now, if you're sitting there going, ew, I am not going to do that, you have my complete sympathy, and you don't have to do it. But I will tell you, the research makes it very clear, by telling your boss what they're good at, what you admire about them, they will feel a little less threatened. It will calm some of that ego defensiveness. Now, if they are horribly indecisive, don't go, by the way, you're so decisive. I love the way you make decisions. It has to be a genuine compliment. And I think this is true in every aspect of your life. Please don't make fake compliments, but especially true with the boss who feels insecure, because they will be looking out for moments of untruth. So you really have to be sincere. And lastly, again, some really wonderful research that shows with abusive supervision, which I think the insecure boss often falls in, but in abusive supervision is what we refer to it in the academic literature, can be shifted if you can prove to your boss that they actually need you. They need your expertise, they need your guidance. You have a piece of information or a skill that no one else on the team has. And that can alter the balance of power between you and your boss so that they are much kinder to you as a result. All right, let's talk about the pessimist. The pessimist is actually one of the archetypes I'm hearing a lot about lately. I think partly with what's going on in the economy, partly in general how people are feeling about work, about the world. There are more and more people who are concerned and expressing doubt and negativity. It's frustrating though, right? So let's think about, okay, what's the behavior that's problematic? Someone saying, oh, I think things aren't gonna work out, right? Not necessarily problematic in and of itself. But if they shut down the conversation, if they make you question whether or make the team question whether the project's gonna succeed over and over, if they take an outsized role on the team with that negativity, that is problematic. So what would explain it? What would explain some pessimism? Now, for some people, it's simply anxiety. Some people, it's an outlook on life. They either were brought up with it or they learned it over time. And again, pessimism in itself isn't necessarily bad. Who among us hasn't looked at something and been like, wow, that is not gonna work, or oh, that's gonna go terribly. We've all done that. So again, it's not problematic in and of itself unless it's having consequences on the work, right? Unless it's having consequences on the team and the culture. So what role might you be playing? Let me just tell you, pessimists think optimists are idiots. So if you go to a pessimist and say, I don't know why you think the world is so horrible. It's actually a wonderful place. And I don't know why you think this project is gonna fail. It's totally gonna succeed. We're gonna exceed our targets, right? The pessimist is sitting there going, you're a moron. So you have to really watch out for that polarization, and you have to watch out that you're not encouraging the pessimism by insisting on optimism, insisting on positivity. And that's the very first tactic you want to try, which is to watch out that when they're like, no, it won't work, you don't go, yeah, well, right? Because then you're in a tug of war. Where do you have to go? So make sure that you're not insisting on positivity. You also can give them a role to play. And I actually love to call this, some people call this devil's advocate. I like to call it the disagreeer in chief. And give them a formal role to play. So, because instead of what happens, and again, there's interesting research that shows this, and a team dynamic when everyone's sort of coalescing around an idea or an innovation or a strategy, and then one person speaks up, and it's counterintuitive or contrarian or slightly cynical, we give that person a ton of power. And while it's important that we make sure we point out what the risks are, we have to be sure we don't get dragged into the pessimist viewpoint, right? That's the real risk, is that the pessimist ends up gaining power. And oftentimes, that's why people will resort to pessimism, because they feel powerless. So if you give them a role to play, you can right-size their perspective. That contrarian perspective, the risks they're pointing out, give them that role. And at a specific designated time in your meeting, you turn to them and go, all right, you are awesome at pointing out risks. What are we missing? And how do we mitigate?